Oh, let me go ahead. Oh, it's recording already. And it says the webinar has started. Let me pause.
Leon County for 12 years. All right, I was with Leon County for 12 years, and I've continued being active with NAMA for training and at being on the national board. And I've also continued to do collection event assistance with Clean Earth under Kelby Neal. So anyway, today I'm going to be talking about how HHW facilities can help area VSQGs with their hazardous waste generation. Okay, this is going to be about the kind of information that HHW facilities can provide to local small businesses to help them with their hazardous waste compliance. And so, while regulations are streamlined for small businesses that qualify as VSQGs, there's a few things we can help them to stay in compliance and to help to encourage them to do what they can to remain VSQGs and not step up in generator status and increase their regulatory workload. And of course, a lot of these are things that you're going to be needing to explain to your small businesses, to your nonprofits, to your local government agencies. That hazardous waste is mostly covered by 3 agencies. The EPA, which administers RCRA, OSHA, which oversees the HAZWOPER standard, and Department of Transportation, which handles the transport and labeling. And for many states, there are state level departments that also can become involved in these regulations. For many of these regulations, states cannot have less restriction, but they can add additional restrictions onto the federal level regulations. And one of the big points to explain to them is that they are a generator. Unless you're in someplace like California where HHW is still regulated, the household exemption applies in most states. So, homeowners, rental people, basically just residents, are exempt from the regulations, but absolutely everybody else is considered a generator under RCRA. And so this is going to be small businesses, nonprofits, and government entities are all considered generators. And tax exempt status does not necessarily mean that they're exempt from disposal fees. A local municipality may decide that it applies. That's up to them. That's the choice they make. But since the disposal fee is not a tax, most places, they still apply. It's just like a nonprofit going across the scales for regular, class 1 drop off. They're gonna have to pay the disposal fees. Same thing applies at a HHW facility. And also for inside your own agency, like if you're a county government, other county offices, this will be an internal decision within that government as to whether or not the other government agencies within that organization will be charged. Like, for instance, if the facilities management brings leftover paint to the HHW, whether or not they want to track it as just it's all being covered under the HHW, or whether they want to charge back to the facilities management, so to better represent who within the government is generating the waste and for our tracking purposes. So this is going to be usually one of those higher level decisions that are made, and can often get sometimes a little politically charged as stakeholders basically want free disposal. So it can get interesting. And when you do have, if you are accepting VSQG, either you or your vendor, depending upon how you're handling it, that'll be covered later. You will be needing to get basic information from the generator, such as their company name or their personal name, if it's a just a sole proprietorship or something like that, and you'll need their address, phone number, email can also be useful. And if it's a larger company, it's best to have a contact person. And usually when you have a drop off, you'll also need the name of the person or persons who are responsible for delivering the material to you. And you'll want to keep track of this. So you can check against, local business records to make sure they're a legitimate business. If you're in an area that's has strict about location of the service area, you can check to make sure that they are actually within your service area, things like that. But yeah, you will definitely need to pick up this kind of information from your generators. And of course, just doing a quick overview of the different types of generators. If you're in an HHW facility, you may be authorized to collect from the very small quantity generators. These used to be called conditionally exempt small quantity generators, but too many of these thought conditionally exempt. They just saw exempt and thought no rules applied to them. So of course you've got the classic 100 kilograms of hazardous waste and 1 kilogram of acute hazardous waste per month. And one of the big things to train your VSQG customers on, and they understand that this is an absolute limit. This isn't averaged out over several months. This is you're only allowed to produce, this amount per month. You can't do 150 kilograms this month and 50 next month and average it out. You have to keep your production underneath those limits. And they have an accumulation limit of 1,000 kilograms. This can also occasionally be an issue with some places. I know from discussions, probably one of the biggest places that have difficulty with this are places like Goodwill that are bringing in donations, and they get a lot of material that really should not be generated, but it is basically the equivalent of hazardous waste, so they have to have some way to handle it. Different jurisdictions have different ways of handling places like Goodwill. In some places, the Goodwill may no longer qualify as a VSQG because of the amount of material they processed. And even though they're the smallest quantity, they still have to, it is their responsibility to ensure that they get their hazardous waste either picked up or dropped off at an authorized facility. Then we bump up to small quantity generators, which one of the big things is they have to get an EPA generator number. Of course, they're up to 1,000 kilograms of hazardous waste, but still limited to 1 kilogram of acute waste, and have a higher accumulation limit and a limit on the number of days they can hold it based upon transport distance for their vendor. You could probably still, even though you may not be able to accept things to them, small quantity generators will often contact HHWs for information and advice, and I find it's a good idea to help to provide this information to them as you can, to share your knowledge and to help them remain in compliance. And some facilities have written into their contracts that with their hazardous waste vendor, that SQGs can piggyback onto their contract for disposal, so that while the generator has to contact the vendor and arrange pickup and all of that stuff, they get usually the better prices HHW facility can get. So that's something you can do to help your local small quantity. Large quantity generators is very rare that they will contact an HHW facility. They're big enough, they know what they're doing or what they're supposed to be doing. Although in some places I still wouldn't put it past a large quantity generator to try to sneak some stuff through just to save money. And of course, you know, this can sometimes be interesting to explain to small businesses, especially new ones who are just getting started. And if, you know, sometimes maybe if you think back to when you were first getting involved, it's like trying to understand the difference between your listed waste and your characteristic wastes. And hopefully they're not going to be bringing you mixed waste. So for the most part, you're not going to, even from most small businesses, you're not going to be seeing your F or K listed wastes, except for, I mean, some of the small things I could think of, or some small jewelers may end up with things like electroplating waste. That would fall under some of these categories, but otherwise you're still just going to be getting material that's going to be either you listed or going to be falling in under a characteristic waste. And your classic definitions of ignitable, corrosive, reactive, and toxic. And yeah, and again, this takes, you know, a little bit of, it's important to get them to understand this, because sometimes you can also help them to understand that, you know, this is, while you wouldn't want to stick your hands in it, it doesn't meet the definition, so it is not a hazardous waste, and which can help them meet their generator status limits and help them to find the proper disposal method. Because sometimes the businesses will want to err on the side of caution and bring you materials that really are not hazardous. So this, you can help them on that basis to properly sort. But in the end, it is the generator's responsibility to determine if their wastes are hazardous, you know, and to make the proper determination. You know, you can explain to them by, you know, matching to your listed waste types, if that applies, and teach them how to use their reference materials like safety data sheets to check on if it's characteristic wastes. Or sometimes you may have to have them tell them that they do need to get a laboratory determination. You know, this is going to apply for something like the toxic characteristic leaching procedure, or TCLIP, which, for those who may not know, this simulates landfill leaching conditions. And if the test material reaches a hazardous material above a given threshold for that material, it's considered a hazardous waste. If it's below, it's not. One situation where we did run into this, I was hoping to help a customer, but was an indoor shooting range in which they had some of their shooting range debris from their targets and the filters from the air system, because it was an indoor shooting range. And I advised them to get a TCLIP done on their filters. I was hoping that it would come out below, but it came out above regulatory limits, so we did have to work with them to accept those filters as hazardous waste. Fortunately, although they were large and bulky, they were fairly lightweight, so they had no problem staying within their limit. We just had to put them into cubic yard boxes because the air filters were just so physically large. And sometimes when you're working with businesses, you know, you're convincing them that, you know, they have to do this. They are responsible under RCRA. They are responsible for the hazardous waste they generate, and they can be, you know, fined or receive other administrative or criminal punishments if they violate the law in respect to their hazardous waste. And one of the big things is, once you can get them to understand that this is something they have to deal with, is that, you know, HHW facilities, since they usually are shipping large quantities can often get competitive bid contracts that lowers the individual cost for materials. So when VSQGs can ship through an HHW, they can take advantage of these lower costs, because most HHW facilities will just be looking at cost recovery from their VSQGs, so they can pass this cost saving on to them. One of the big things you can tell these VSQG customers is if they ship with a vendor, they're going to be shelling out for $1,000, $2,000 for a mobilization fee, which is just having them show up with a crew to handle stuff. And that right there can be a big incentive. VSQGs are allowed to self-transport to an HHW facility, and that's another big savings for them. And they don't need to go through the paperwork of getting an EPA generator number for their normal operation. So these are all important points you can share with your small businesses and other VSQGs to encourage them, if your facility is set up to accept VSQG waste, to bring it to you. And these are just kind of very, very kind of thumbnail, but just to kind of give them an idea of the regulatory burden by generator. The VSQG rules were purposely made very minimal, so that there's not much the generator has to do. A lot of the, if they're bringing it to like an HHW facility, they take care of most of that. So if they can keep themselves as a VSQG, their administrative and regulatory burden is much smaller. The burden increases once they move to an SQG. They have to get, their EPA number. They now have more limits on storage, things like that. And of course, an LQG has a much larger regulatory burden. And so that's another big part, especially, here in the South, there's a lot of businesses, are rather conservative and want to minimize their regulatory burden. And this can be used as a good tool to convince them to use your facility. And this is a big thing that's come up lately. And for those of you who are Florida, hopefully you listened to Andrea's full webinar on episodic generation a couple of months ago. And that should be up on the NAMA webinar archive by now. But an episodic generation is a fairly new rule from a couple of years ago that allows exceptional situations for VSQG or SQGs to exceed their generator limits. There's two types: a planned generation. This would be for something like, they're going to be changing processes and they know they're going to have an excess of old material that they will need to dispose of. This is something they can plan around, they can set a date. And so in this situations, they need to contact their state regulatory authority 30 days before, go through the paperwork, online forms, or whatever's appropriate for their state to get set up. And unplanned, this is usually going to be something in the case of a spill or an accident where they've got over their generator limit and waste generated over a very short time and that they hadn't planned on. And in this case, they need to contact the regulatory authority within 72 hours of the beginning of the incident. So 72 hours from once the spill happened or the incident started. And one of the big things to make sure they understand here is that if it's falling under the episodic generation rules for being over their amounts, it has to be transported by a licensed hazmat transporter. They cannot take advantage of self-transport in those cases. So the costs are going to be greater from them, but taking advantage of this rule will allow them to avoid a lot of regulatory issues. And of course, since it's going to be transported, these will be manifested, so they will remain the generator, and they will still be fully applicable for cradle to grave for their instance. And a lot of HHW facilities will coincidentally also handle universal waste, and you can apply this also to your business, in which, of course, the universal waste is a set of waste streams that were set up to, again, streamline the standards for some very commonly generated materials so that they can be quickly and efficiently kept out of the solid waste stream and make sure it's handled properly. One of the big things is that this universal waste does not count towards your hazardous waste generator standards. This can be a big thing with large buildings that generate a lot of fluorescent 4-foot or 8-foot fluorescent lamps. This is not counting towards their generator status. And the federal list is, of course, batteries recalled or pesticides collected through a collection event, mercury-containing equipment, lamps, and aerosol cans. This is the baseline at the federal level. Various states have added additional material to their universal waste list, including consumer electronics, thermostats, cathode ray tubes, elemental mercury or dental amalgams, and things like that. And some of them even gone up to paint-related waste, which for some of the VSQGs can make a pretty big difference. And of course, we've got totally different levels for your waste handlers, but pretty much most HHW facilities are going to stay in the small quantity handler range because they're going to accumulate less than 5,000 kilograms of lamps. And then after that, it's similar to the hazardous waste. You've got your transporters. They can have 10-day facilities, and then you must have your destination facilities, which are essentially still a TSDF. And one of the important things for teaching businesses for working at their facility are accumulation points or containers for hazardous waste they may generate in small quantities through their normal operations. This is things like waste solvents, like they may generate one or 2 liters at a time, and then they will accumulate in a 5-gallon container or a drum. These accumulation containers must be clearly labeled with the material name. It has to have an accumulation start date, which will feed back to their generator status. It has to be appropriate for the material, so you can't be accumulating hydrochloric acid in a steel drum. And again, a lot of these rules, a lot of this will be kind of familiar for HHW staff to pass on, because these are things that they should be doing anyway within their own facility. The container should be closed when material is not actually being added. And of course, it is subject to accumulation time limits. And if you're working with these, this is one of the newer rules that's come in the last few years, and that's your solvent contaminated wipes. Again, help your small businesses to beat the rules and to be in compliance. If you can help them avoid, being cited, they will be appreciative. So again, the wipes are exempt if the solvent only meets the D001 through F005 ignitable characteristic standard. But again, and there's also details like your trichloroethylene wipes are hazardous waste. Reusable ones can be laundered. Okay, your wipes that contain other characteristics are not exempted. But regardless, your containers are what they call performance-based, which means they have to be able to handle the materials contained in them and remain closed properly when not in use or when they're being transported. Again, one of the big things, The containers must be essentially liquid tight so that if there's liquid in there, they're not going to leak out or splash out. But when they're transported, there cannot be free liquids. They have to be either absorbed onto the wipes or some absorbent must be in there. Again, there's a specific label they have to have, the excluded solvent contaminated wipes. And this has got a 180-day accumulation limit, and they must keep records on it. So important information that needs to be passed on to your small businesses. And training, this is a good opportunity for outreach for an HHW facility. When you're picking up on the small businesses, you can help train them, let them know what they can't do, what their requirements are. You'll probably have to work with your organization's risk management, so they'll decide what level of liability they're willing to accept, and they may or may not put some limits on what you can do. Or you may be able to direct them to what type of training they're going to need if your risk management is not going to allow you to do much direct training yourself. Conversely, the facilities need to make sure that their staff are properly trained on handling the VSQGs. They know the procedures and they know the protocols, and they also know the rules that the businesses need to follow, and they should be able to clearly give information. Like I said, this is good for outreach, and a good idea for those in Florida, work with your county SQG inspectors. You can provide them with literature that they can give to businesses. They can be often will be the first point of contact that will find a new business, and they'll be able to advise them to go to an HHW facility if it's available. So these are all great ideas for getting things, passing on the knowledge. And different facilities will have different collecting formats. Like I said, in Florida, an HHW facility does need to have authorization from the EP to accept VSQG materials. So this is one of the first things to make sure you have, and then they will be able to, you may or may not, depending upon the authorization, commingle your VSQG with HHW. This can be done because this allows more efficient use of drums and containers, and you can pack things more efficiently. In this case, the HHW facility is then assuming the generator status like it does with all of the HHW that it ships. Other facilities, if they're not authorized to commingle, they will separately pack the VSQG material from their HHW material, and they may also separately, and this may be separately manifested from their HHW. Some counties I know have basically their hazardous waste vendor will show up on particular days of the month, like maybe twice a month or once a month, depending upon their contract. And they handle the business and VSQG waste directly. They check it, they weigh it, they assess it, they drum it up, they provide the manifest, and they do the direct billing. So, that is one way to handle it. And in that case, the generator will usually get a copy of the manifest for themselves. And then for timing wise, many places will do it by appointment, or say there will be a specific day, or like every other Friday, they accept business waste, or some places will actually accept walk-ins. And I know there's some counties that have mobile business units that will have a box truck that by appointment will go to VSQGs and pick up the material, so that which in a lot of ways is a good idea if you've got the finances to it, because the VSQGs often do not know how to safely transport, although you can provide the information to them with your training. It's often a good idea to have a more knowledgeable person doing the packing and preparing the ship from some of these small businesses. So these are all different options a facility can have for collecting and accepting the waste. And of course, almost always you're going to, there's going to be some kind of fees involved with collecting from businesses. And again, there's different ways of doing this. You can do it itemized by material, by like weight or volume. Some places will do a simple, fixed charge per weight. It all depends upon how your systems are set up and what detail you want to go into. When I was at Leon County, as you can see, we actually did a quite detailed price list, which I saw it as the way to help the generators just only pay for what they were bringing in and what it costs us. Although this is back when the 2-part polyurethane tanks weren't as expensive. They were only $50 each. They're much more expensive now, but again, I thought it was fair to have the contractors that brought those in pay their fair share than trying to amortize that cost over a lot of other business waste. And of course, you're going to have a way to accept payments. I know some places they've had their scale house software companies make modules, or they purchase modules from their software company so that it just plugs into the scale house software and they can run it all sometimes physically at the scale house, or they may have a terminal at the HHW facility where they can tie in. Some places have had standalone accounting software because of, again, different organizations have different splits on how they handle the accounting. You'll need to determine what types of payments you can accept. For instance, if you have a standalone facility, you may not want to accept cash to avoid some of the liabilities involved with that. And you'll also have to figure out, some way of providing receipts to the customer so that they also have a record of their payment. Advertising, you can't help the customers if they don't know you're there. This is an example of a simple card that we actually provided to SQG generators so they could just hand out when they were doing inspections or working with other businesses. So it was, we did social media blasts where we'd send out information for businesses on what we could handle and what they could do. We would do occasional radio and other things just to try to, whatever is limited by your budget, your creativity, and what your organization's public information office is willing to do to help you. And of course, with everything else, there's going to be the record keeping. You'll want to provide a detailed receipt to the generator, and this is something they should keep for 3 years so that if they're inspected, they can pull it out and show that their proper disposal and where it went. Your state agency may require you to keep a record of the entities that are using it and what materials you accepted. This is so that, for their record keeping and so they can help track to make sure, see if anyone's trying to, pretend to be a VSQG when they're an SQG and things like that. You can use it internally to track your customers to make sure that they're, again, you don't have an SQG that's exceeding that's trying to be a VSQG, or you may just have a VSQG that's just not paying close attention and so you can guide them, say, look, you're getting close to your limits. You need to be careful with this. And it gives you backup information to support your manifest so that helps you to keep track of what's going to be going onto your shipments. And again, keeping track of this also helps you, again, at your cost sharing when you're determining pricing for your fees to be charged. And some places will just look at the direct disposal fee. Others will try to somehow calculate in handling and shipping container fees. That's all up to the facility and how they want to handle it. And you can also use your record keeping as marketing to how effective you are to your local businesses. You know, if you can show how much you're able to help them, perhaps, you know, how much you're potentially saving them if they're using you. So overall, you know, if your facility can be set up and get permission to handle VSQG waste, I think it's a good idea. I think it's very helpful to the community to have a more affordable outlet for these small businesses than like the mobilization fee to get a hazmat vendor out. And it helps to avoid, you know, illegal dumping or them trying to sneak things in at a collection event and things like that. So overall, I encourage, you know, the HHW facilities, since they already have the knowledgeable staff and the facilities, I think it's a good idea for them to be available, and when, you know, when the regulatory entities allow them within their particular municipalities or states to be able to help the VSQGs out. So, all right, and time for questions.
Okay, Richard. That was really a great presentation. I'm impressed with all of the regulatory stuff you put in for VSQGs and SQGs. I did want to mention a tip that with F-listed waste, don't forget about your spent solvents, the F001s through F005. So I'm sure a lot of those facilities might have some spent acetone or spent lacquer thinner that would actually be an F-listed waste. In addition to, like, if you get those electroplating waste, etc. So the only question we had actually so far, and there's still an opportunity for people to put their questions in the Q&A box, was about getting a copy of the presentation. I know we're recording the actual presentation, but would you be willing to PDF your slides, maybe on a handout thing, and then Brody can send out that along with the recording link, if you don't mind?
Oh, I'll be happy to.
Okay, so send that over to me and I'll get it to Brody once I request the recording.
I'll do the conversion and get it sent over to you today. That's no problem.
Okay, and I did learn while you were doing your presentation as well that I do have the ability to unmute people that do want to just speak up and ask any questions. Richard's got a lot of experience in this area, so please take advantage of him being on the call right now. Let's see, we got a comment from Paul saying Minnesota recognizes minimal generators. Oh, interesting. And requires all generators to get an ID number, but only charges VSQGs and larger. Huh. Right.
So as I was saying, there's different state.
Yeah.
You know, states can have more stringent regulations. You know, we're in Florida. Florida basically is just running off of the federal level. So, but like I said, I know California has more stringent. More. Yeah. Well, we do have a few more. Yeah. But at the we use the federal generator status. That's why I should have said.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah, I have not heard through my calls with the EPA and the other states about the minimal generator, so I find that interesting. So we also have Elizabeth commenting. Let me look through this. She's asking about large organizations with multiple locations listed as different types of generators. They have been accepting waste from a variety of federal agencies located there. And go ahead and speak on that. And I do apologize, you guys, that I did not introduce myself. I probably should put my camera back on too. I am Andrea Sturmer with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, and I am a hazardous waste state inspector. And I'm on the training committee and helping with the webinars with NAMA Florida chapter. So that's how I'm still involved with NAMA as well. So I can, Richard, if you want to go ahead and touch on that question, then I can always fill in any gaps.
That one gets kind of touchy. It kind of depends upon how independent the facilities are from each other. You know, if they really are operating more or less independently from other units of that agency, they usually can fit that. But if you're talking federal's pretty much they should have their own, they're going to be a small quantity or higher. So they should have their own thing, which reminds me with an issue that I've run into sometimes and had to educate. Here in Tallahassee, we have 2 state universities, and I've had to explain to laboratories that they're a small quantity generator and that they have an internal hazardous waste program so that we cannot accept their materials.
So now I can give you the official RCRA side of it as well.
Yeah.
Which is we consider a facility would be someone under the same ownership and the property is contiguous. So if you have a science building, for example, on Main Street, and down this, a mile away, you have I said science. Okay, you have maintenance, and maintenance is generating hazardous waste. If that's not contiguous property owned by the same entity, then they would be separate facilities, and they would have separate ID numbers if they needed ID numbers. So yes, if you have agencies that are in different buildings that are separate from the government campus, I don't know how well I'm wording this, but as long as it's not one big property owned by a county or whatever, they each would individually have to calculate their generator status. I hope
that makes sense.
So contiguous property owned by the same people, they all have to be under one ID number and all have to calculate their hazardous waste all at one time for each agency. So that actually was a really good question. So hopefully, Elizabeth, if that wasn't clearly answered, you could go ahead and put a follow-up in there.
Yeah.
And then we did have another person comment about liability and providing guidance. You want to touch on that, Richard?
Like I said, that's one of those, again, there can be liability on it. And that's why you'll need to coordinate with your agency's risk management professionals and what they're going to allow. Some places are very just like some counties will not allow reuse centers because they don't want to accept the liability. So
there, I think they're just asking about your guidance. And I think when you said follow up with, check with your state agent, like, for example, you're not there to make their waste determination. That is their responsibility.
Yes. Like I said, that's why, but you could point them to where to go. But again, and how much information you can provide is work with your risk management so that they're going to want to know if you're providing information to the public, they'll want to know, and they'll be able to say, this is good, this is going too far. We don't want to assume the liability if they misunderstand what you told them.
Plus, my other thought on that is that the agencies that you're helping give out that education probably have guidance documents on those topics, such as what are the regulations for a very small, and what are the regulations for solvent wipes, et cetera. So you can give them those guidance documents. Yes. And that kind of puts it back.
Like I said, that's why I said provide them or where to look for the information and things like that.
Perfect. So we had another comment. I'm going to go ahead and let me click this one. That Eric is commenting that there's strictly HHW collection, and that the information will be helpful for them to educate commercial customers who attempt to bring in material. Absolutely. I agree that gives you more knowledge. Some people don't realize that nonprofits are subject to the regulations, and Richard covered that really well. So I'm glad that information will still help you, even though you're not collecting small business waste and helping them with disposal. So Elizabeth is putting a follow-up comment on here. If the state assigned 2 buildings next to each other, different ID numbers, even though they're contiguous, how would that work? I find it interesting that the state assigned 2 different EPA ID numbers, but it is their responsibility to determine how the ID numbers are going to be assigned. So if they have 2 different ID numbers, then unless you want to follow up with that state agency and ask them why it isn't under one number, if they have 2 different ID numbers, then you would be safe to treat them as 2 different entities.
Yes.
But in North Carolina, we would tend to sign one ID number for.
I I would hazard that's probably an internal separation. It's like, this is going to be, program A has this number, and then program B has this number, and all of their waste is going out on separate budget line items. So they set it up that way so that the bookkeeping
we don't like that in
behind
general,
the scenes. Yeah,
I would say in general, we don't want facilities that are owned by the same entity calling this one a very small and this one a small and avoiding being a large or something like that. I do have one site that has two distinct operations going on, and they're both larges, so it's not like it's impacting. They're getting around the rules, and they have two different ID numbers. Elizabeth, you might just want to ask the state why they decided to do that, if you want to be absolutely comfortable accepting their VSQG waste, and make sure they're VSQGs. So, and then I do have one. Let me go ahead and click these so I can get rid of them. What about facilities that change their generator status? Wait until they're listed as a VSQG for a year, or take their word for it? That's pretty tough. That's a tougher one. Do you have any examples of when you've dealt with that, Richard? Because certainly facilities, they're calculating their generator status on a calendar monthly basis, so it can fluctuate. Typically, though, we would tell them to notify at the higher status, because they are going to have to meet those requirements while they're a small, and they wouldn't be able to use a collection. So I think I would be a little hesitant.
That's one of those, if they're actually dropping down, is, I would ask them to start showing evidence that they're consistently, not just, like I said, not averaging it out, but that they're consistently under the 100 kilogram or limit to do it. And so that's going to be, you're going to ask them that they're going to have to document it. Because basically, if they've managed to get rid of their SQG, they should already have dropped and should be able to document that they're generating less than.
You said the word documentation, which I think is a key here. With the generator improvement rules that happened in 2018, facilities are required to show or demonstrate their category. So these smaller sites, especially that might fluctuate, the states are typically recommending that they keep some type of, like, an Excel spreadsheet or something to demonstrate what their generator status is, and it is now required by rule. Paul mentioned that Minnesota goes by address, and yes, in general, EPA ID numbers are assigned to an address. But if you have a college and it's a campus and it's going across many miles, typically that college is going to get one EPA ID number, even though they might have multiple addresses for each building. I'm laughing at Elizabeth's comment about their DEQ is a bit of a mess. I'm sorry to hear that. So we'll give another minute or so for any more questions. I think there's been great participation, and I hope you found the webinar interesting. I'm going to click on this live. Okay, so we are going to get a PDF of the presentation, and there'll be a link to the recording. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. And I think at this point,